Well, we're moving right along through this lecture series, and now we're going to talk about question-response formats. We're also going to talk about the different dimensions that questions and data can have. So first of all, there are really three formats that we're going to be using in this class for questions, very generally. One is open-ended questions, and those are questions that are kind of similar to essay questions on a test, where a question is asked, and the respondent can answer back with whatever they want to say. It's open-ended. They can answer back in words, they can answer back in numbers, they can answer back in symbols, whatever makes them comfortable. We can also ask close-ended categorical questions. Now, close-ended categorical questions force respondents to select a choice from a list, or choices from a list. Sometimes one of those choices might be other, and then they can fill in what other means for them in kind of an open-ended way, but it's still a close-ended categorical question for the most part because it forces them to select a choice or choices from a list rather than just letting them say whatever they want. So a good example of a close-ended categorical question would be a multiple choice question on a test or a true or false question on a test. And notice true or false only has two choices, but it's a close-ended categorical question. You can pick choice A or choice B, true or false. On a multiple choice question, you might have multiple choice where you can only pick one, or you might have multiple answer where you can pick several. So there are different ways to go about asking those close-ended categorical questions, but again, it's all centered around the idea of having a list from which you choose the choice that best describe, or the choices that best describe what you think or feel. We can also ask close-ended scaled questions, which are sort of a variation on the categorical questions because they force respondents to rate or rank something on a scale. So a good example of that would be like a satisfaction survey. On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with the service you received today? The categories that you're giving are going to be numbers that are on that scale of 1 to 10, but the scale is really a little bit different in what you're responding than the categories, and there's a reason for that. That's because question choices can have 4 different dimensions. So the first dimension that any question choice can have is having a descriptive power, what we call description. And that means that every category on your list of choices has some kind of descriptive label. So what's your gender, male or female? Those are descriptions. What year are you in school, freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior? Those are descriptions. How satisfied are you on a scale of 1 to 5? 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 are all descriptions of how satisfied you are. So every choice in a question, that's close-ended at least, has some kind of descriptive ability. Actually, in open-ended questions they do as well, it's just that how we deal with those data are a little bit different. In a close-ended question, you're definitely going to see description on every choice. The next thing that we can look at is order. So not all questions have order. Many do, though, where there's some kind of implied order or hierarchy in the choices that are being offered. So what gender are you, male or female, is descriptive, but it doesn't have any order. Male and female, there's no hierarchy there. There's nothing to suggest that male is better than female or worse than female or higher or lower or quantitatively more or less. Trust me on this one, guys. Order is really important for any time that there's a direction being suggested. So freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, for example, suggests a direction. But the next dimension that questions can have involves distance. And freshman, sophomore, junior, senior don't necessarily have distance between each other because distance implies that there are equal intervals between each step. Now you might think freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior have equal intervals, but they're just terms. They describe roughly what year in school you are. They don't describe exactly how many hours you've taken or exactly how many years you've been in school. And in fact, senior can encompass seniors and super seniors, that have been in school for 5 or 6 years. So distance implies that you have discrete points that are equidistant from one another, kind of like being on a scale. So for example, if you ask, what's the temperature today on a Fahrenheit scale, then you're going to have discrete points that tell you what the temperature is. If I say 72 and 73, we know that there's an order, there's a hierarchy, that 73 is more than 72, but we also know that there is 1 unit of difference between those two measurements that I've taken. And that's what distance is. It tells us that there's an equidistance between each point and that we have units of measure that can help us to differentiate them. And then finally we have origin, and origin is probably the toughest thing for students to understand. Origin says that there is some point on our scale that has something that we call a true zero, and what that true zero means is that at that point we have nothing. We don't just have zero of something, we have actually nothing. So for example, if I have $0 in my bank account, I have no money. It doesn't mean that on a scale of infinity to negative infinity that I have zero, so I'm right in the middle. It means that I have nothing. I have no money whatsoever. If I have 0 pounds, if I weigh 0 pounds, I don't exist. I have to weigh something in order to exist. In order to have some kind of human body, I have to weigh something. Even if it's a microgram, even if I'm a tiny, tiny little person, I have to weigh something. If my age is 0, and I mean really 0, it means that I'm not born. It means that I don't exist. I'm not a human being yet. I know, debatable where life begins, but let's say even if we're talking back to the moment of conception, if we're saying I have 0 at the moment of conception, that means that I'm not yet conceived. I don't yet exist. My point is that origin means that you have nothing. You can't go any lower than nothing. Now, some people like to say, well, your bank account example, take that for example, you can have negative dollars in your bank account, and you're right, you can. A bank account is not actually measuring how much money you have. A bank account is actually measuring how much money you have, positive or negative, with relation to the bank. But let's say that you actually take all your money out of the bank and you can physically hold it. If you have nothing in your hand, you have no money. If you have 50 cents in your hand, you have some money. It's more than 0. It's something tangible that you really have. So my point is, a true 0 means that you have nothing. And don't get confused, for example, with a temperature scale, where a 0, for example, on a Celsius or a Fahrenheit scale relates not to the absence of temperature, but it relates to the boiling point of water, or to where the scale begins. That's a little bit different from having nothing. The only temperature scale that actually has an origin is the Kelvin scale, where a 0 means that nothing has any temperature. So don't get confused about the fact that some scales have a 0 on them. That 0 doesn't always mean that there's an origin. It just means that there's an arbitrary point that's been named 0. Okay. I know that can get a little confusing. Please refer to the notes if you get confused on that. But what I want you to understand is that we have 4 different labels that we use to describe either the types of questions or the types of data that they generate, based on whether they have the presence of description, order, distance, and origin. And hopefully you've learned this in a previous course, but let's go over it again because it's really important. Because the way that you're going to ask questions in our surveys, you really need to know what kind of data that you're going to get, because the kind of data that you get change the types of analyses that you can conduct, and they also change the kinds of information that you're going to receive. So if you have a question that only has descriptive labels but doesn't have any order, distance, or origin, you have a nominal question. And a nominal question is one of the 2 forms of what we call categorical questions. So again, if you ask people, are you male or female? That is a nominal question. If you ask them, do you live in St. Louis, Edwardsville, O'Fallon, Fairview Heights, or Belleville, just to pick a few cities around here, that's a nominal question. There is no order in asking those. You're not asking, do you live more to the east or more to the west? You're not asking anything like that. You're just asking them to tell you where they live in a very descriptive way, but nothing else. Ordinal questions add in that element of order. So, junior, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, for example, would imply an order. You can say, are you more satisfied or less satisfied? That would imply some order. Those points aren't necessarily equidistant from each other, but they give you some kind of relative understanding of direction. Those are ordinal questions. And ordinal questions are also in that categorical group. Now, students often get a little confused about what's ordinal and what's interval. Typically, an interval question has some kind of numbers associated with the scale points. So that distance that's suggested, interval questions have points that are equidistant from one another. So if you say, how satisfied are you? Are you very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, satisfied, not very satisfied, or not at all satisfied? That's probably an ordinal question, but we sometimes treat it as an interval question because We could also ask that question on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you, with 1 being not at all satisfied and 5 being very satisfied. We're going to talk about scales here in our next lecture in the series, but we can treat some ordinal data as being interval if it's kind of similar in structure to it. But remember, purely speaking, an interval scale has equidistant points, so that scale of 1 to 5 would be interval for sure. The ordinal scale that has labels that are they seem like they're equidistant, but they're maybe, a little less definite. That's actually ordinal data, but there is some flexibility there. Now, interval data and the next kind of data, which is interval data that has a true zero, so it's what we call ratio data. Those are both what we call metric questions or metric data. And the nice thing about metric data is that you can do a lot more with it analytically than you can with categorical data. And when we talk about analysis in a few weeks, you really get a sense for how much more you can do with metric data. Metric data is much higher quality data. It has a lot more capabilities, and it has a lot more interpretation that you can draw from it than you can from categorical data. So whenever possible, we like to take metric measurements if they're going to suit our purposes for analysis. We usually rely on categorical data either where we can't get metric measurements or where we're not looking to do a high level of analysis. All right, with that said, I want to run you through some interval scales, and that's what's going to be our next lecture. And don't get too tripped up on the terminology just yet, but review the notes and review the textbook about these labels, because they are very, very important, and you need to be able to identify which is which, say, if they should come up on an exam.